Welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Trump is in trouble. He's consistently 10 points behind Biden in the polls, and more worryingly still, the tide seems to have turned against him in key swing states and the South. Are states like Texas, with its 38 votes in the Electoral College, really up for grabs? Well, that's our focus today, the South. And I'm delighted to have Simon Romero of the New York Times with us. Simon, can you just tell us where you are and what areas you cover, just to get going?
Oh, well, first off, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm joining you today from Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is where I'm based. I cover the Southwest from this spot, and that includes, of course, New Mexico, Arizona, much of West Texas, much of the U.S.-Mexico border region, the borderlands, and it's just a fascinating place to cover. So very glad to join you.
It's an amazing, and also for the purpose of what we do, the areas you cover, the sort of different ethnics and political mix and economic mix is going to be fascinating to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us. We've also got Jeff Smith here, who's the National Security Editor with the Center for Public Integrity in Washington. Jeff, delighted to have you back. You spoke to us in April. Just so you can remind everyone, can you just jolt people's memory? Maybe we didn't talk about it last time. Just talk a bit about the center's work, why it's so interesting.
We're a nonprofit investigative newsroom based in Washington, D.C., and we try to cover stories that other people are not covering. We're focused on, obviously, like everyone else, on the pandemic and the election, but not to the exclusion of other issues and problems, including social inequity issues, police brutality, and many others. So,
yeah. Great. Well, it's well worth visiting the website. It's got some really interesting reports there. Just to underline, this particular briefing is off the record, and it's for Insight members only. Nothing here can be attributed to our speakers this time, so please don't share it on email or social media. Simon, I'd like to start with you. Can you just give us an introduction, an overview? What has the effect been of the pandemic in the South, and more specifically the area that you report on?
Well, it really differs greatly from region to region and from state to state. Where I'm at right now in New Mexico, we've been remarkably fortunate, might be the right word to use, and that we have political leadership in this state, which has been very assertive in its response to the pandemic since the early days of the crisis. And very steady in its response, despite escalating criticism and the economic fallout from what's been happening here. So case counts and the overall death count here in the state of New Mexico remain relatively low. But whenever I cross into Arizona, it's a different story. Whenever I cross into West Texas, it's an especially different story. And if you look further along the border into South Texas, that's where the real crisis is taking place. Those counties are being hit just incredibly hard right now. The numbers are especially alarming in that cluster of counties right on the border with Mexico, around the cities of McAllen and Brownsville, right around there. We've seen some relative success, though, over in the state of Arizona, where authorities have reintroduced some mitigation measures, which have had a pretty important effect on things, bringing their case numbers down. So Arizona is sort of showcasing how quickly also things can change in this region when political leaders, take sometimes unpopular but correct decisions, really, to address them.
I was just looking at some of the reporting on those areas in South Texas, and it is really sort of grueling stuff. Hospitals, overwhelmed, and I think the highest death counts in the whole of the United States in 5 counties in the south of Texas. So, right. Looking particularly bad. We'll come back to the economic and the political fallout from that in just a second, Simon. But Jeff, I want to turn to you. Last time you sort of pointed to this. You said that the southern states were letting the virus, the pandemic, sort of rip, and that this would come to affect Trump and Trump's voters in the end. Do you still think that's the case, Jeff?
Yes, I do. I think the White House has, according to conversations among insiders and statements made by President Trump, largely viewed the pandemic in political terms. The president was opposed at the outset, for example, to emergency pandemic relief because he said some of the funds would wind up in states run by Democratic governors. He also has sought transparently to suppress information about the virus, about how widespread it is, admitting in June that he said to my people, slow the testing down, please. So Trump supporters who are insulated by Trump's rhetoric and by the statements of other conservative politicians from a deeper reality about the extent of the pandemic, and as well as problems in the economy, inequalities, climate and weather threats, and other social problems, have found persistent sustenance for their views in the Fox TV network. And I have to bring that up right away because it's a big part of the debate and controversy surrounding what's happened so far, as well as what's likely to happen in the next 100 days. A working paper posted, in May noticed, for example, that people who where in zip codes where there was an increase in Fox News viewership, that people were less likely to stay home. And they also, this is consistent with other data showing red state residents tend to be more risk-taking in their personal decisions. States with the lowest, in America, with the lowest rates of seatbelt use, for example, tend to be red. But the virus, which cares not at all about politics and is an equal opportunity threat to everybody, has been the one force with the power to break through the red state bubble, born partly of misunderstandings and low awareness of factual circumstances surrounding the degree of its infectivity and the hazards of its spread. Trump's support began to fall in the red states when they began to see when people who live in them began to see others around them getting ill and dying. And we know that Trump's support has long been concentrated among the elderly, which have been more vulnerable to the virus than those who are younger. Initially, COVID infections were largely a blue state phenomenon, simply and solely because blue states are more populous and more dense, two key factors in the spread of the disease. The turning point for us in the United States was around the Memorial Day holiday in late May, around the time when the White House was pushing all governors to reopen the economy. And this request gained traction mostly, but not only, in Republican states. That's when new COVID-19 cases in red states accelerated and when COVID deaths in red and blue states reached parity. In red states, in fact, polling by the American Enterprise Institute has recently shown higher dissatisfaction with how their governors are managing the pandemic response than in blue states, 79% as opposed to 71%. And in those states that ignored social distancing suggestions, the dissatisfaction rate is even higher. This is partly a result of the fact that more people in red states than blue states have reported seeing their incomes decrease. So the Center for Public Integrity, where I work, obtained a White House document early this month that showed 18 states in the danger zone due to a high weekly rate of new cases, including Arkansas, Tennessee, Texas, North and South Carolina, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. And the 11 states with the highest rates of infection based on positive test results included 8 that typically vote Republican. Now, Simon could probably address the issue that, this is not just because of gubernatorial decision-making. It has a lot to do with population clusters and income levels. For example, on a per capita basis, many of the places in most cases have been small and mid-sized metropolitan areas in the Southwest, such as Arizona and other places in New Mexico and other places on the border with Texas. But it is true that the red states are experiencing something that the blue states did at the outset. And, it was, the disease was at the outset originally a blue state phenomenon, but now it isn't. And so.
Jeff, thanks very much for that. I think it's a good overview. There's a lot to unpack there. Simon, Just give me a sense of what's been going on politically and economically around you, and maybe respond to some of the things that Jeff has raised there, Simon.
I think that Jeff, you make an excellent point about the just incredible influence and sway that Fox News has as a news organization. I think it should arguably be considered the most influential and powerful news organization in this country. It molds public opinion. It bolsters Republican office holders. It reinforces narratives about how things are going, and it introduces just parallel ways of viewing what's happening in the country, with parallel sets of figures and numbers to back everything up. And in just one indication of this, from a reporting trip that I took in recent days, I drove across a congressional district which spans most of the state of New Mexico, and which resembles culturally and economically West Texas in many ways. This is the heart of New Mexico's oil industry. It's in the Permian Basin, which is one of the most coveted oil fields anywhere in the world right now. It has intense fracking activity. This is a basin that really straddles both eastern New Mexico and West Texas. And what I found down there in recent days was that Republicans are actually using the aggressive pandemic response in New Mexico as a campaign rallying cry to criticize Democratic leadership on this issue, and to really focus on the economic fallout of what's been happening, the loss of jobs, especially in the oil and gas industry, the loss of jobs in the tourism industry. And the Republican challenger in this race is mounting a very energetic campaign as a result of this, and I think has a good chance of flipping that seat back into Republican control.
So Simon, just to pick up on that, that's absolutely fascinating. So he's just flipped the argument on its head. He's basically saying, because these Democrats back restrictions, health restrictions, they are the ones who are responsible for damaging our economy, not the president.
It's an incredible reframing of recent history, really, what they're doing, and it could actually end up being quite successful in various parts of the country. Not all parts of the country, of course, but in parts of the country that are heavily dependent on the energy industry, that are already quite conservative. This is a narrative that could really work, and it's essentially really sort of recasting what happened in the early weeks of this crisis, when the president of this country was calling this virus a hoax, when he was ridiculing, strong mitigation efforts. And it was really the governors, the Democratic governors, that were stepping into the void and taking action. And, as a result, some of those actions are quite unpopular. There has been a great deal of economic fallout. Yes, lives have been saved, but livelihoods have been affected in a way which is very damaging. In small towns around West Texas and New Mexico, for instance, you just see one storefront after another shutter. You see a lot of one of the biggest contrasts actually is like it's almost like a different state from Albuquerque and points northward, where nearly everyone is wearing a mask when you go into the grocery store, when you go to the gas station, even when you go on the street or hiking paths to exercise. Once you leave Albuquerque to points southward, it's not almost like a different state, it's almost like a different country. Nearly no one is wearing a mask, and this isn't a state with a very strong mask mandate. It is the law. You have to wear a mask or you face fines, but you have open defiance of these measures by sheriffs and sheriff's deputies, by business owners, and just by many residents who are very skeptical of the usefulness of doing this. So it's a very fractious situation that we're seeing.
Those job losses, are they across the board? I mean, I've been reading that the job losses have been felt in the South more by Hispanic communities, by Black American communities, and less so by small business owners and people in rural areas. In other words, the kind of people you'd expect to vote for Trump.
the job losses are certainly not across the board. They're very uneven, and the recoveries in the recovery that's taking place in parts of the American economy is very indicative of this, because you have classes of people which have more access to education, which have who have white collar jobs, such as myself. I can work from home with relative ease and transition into a different type of working experience that is just not available to people who are in the services economy, or who are picking food out and who are harvesting food out in the fields of California or Texas. We have these huge industrial farming operations. Those options just aren't available to those folks, unfortunately. Now, voting, of course, in the United States is not mandatory. So I think it's really an open question as to whether, populations that have been really hit hard by the pandemic, whether they're going to respond with, newly registered voters who actually turn out to vote. That's a really big sort of like question mark, which kind of shrouds everything right now. Will voter turnout surge, or will it not? We've seen early indications that it could, especially here in New Mexico, where officials have broadly expanded mail-in voting. And that could really produce a very interesting election for both parties. You have an energized, Democratic electorate, which, many of whom are eager to vote against the incumbent in the White House. You also have a highly energized Republican electorate, which is really intent on repelling measures that have been taken at the state level. So it's going to be just a very kind of volatile few weeks ahead of.
Jeff, I was looking at a series of polls produced by the New York Times, and it's essentially, they did it with SurveyMonkey, if people want to look that up. And it basically said that because there's been such polarization in the political debate, people who support Trump really don't care any about the reality. They are divorced from reality. So when the president says your life's going to be fantastic, they're inclined to believe it. So none of this doesn't matter. So you've got Simon there talking about how the argument about the economy has been turned on its head. And then this additional factor in actual fact, the voters don't care anyway, because he's their guy.
So these are valid observations. I mean, a guy at the American Enterprise Institute who's been looking at polling data named Samuel Abrams said just the other day that with the elections less than 100 days away, the question is whether state Republican officials will realize the choices they've made in managing the pandemic are out of step with the outlook of their constituents. And this misalignment could be hard for Trump and Republican candidates to overcome. But the administration's strategy, which has become fairly clear certainly in the last few days as the Republican National Convention gets underway, and also in the weeks before, has been largely to try to distract its potential supporters from the virus response realities by refocusing their attention on issues other than the pandemic, like social upheaval related to police brutality and other matters. The policy of the White House has not materially changed as far as I can see. Trump has made a couple of statements about how wearing a mask is patriotic after initially refusing to wear a mask and suggesting that it was not masculine. But he's just appointed, as one of his top advisors, this guy who is a frequent guest on the Fox News channel, named Dr. Scott Atlas. And he's the sole doctor who was on the stage with Trump at the pandemic briefings in the past week. And he's long questioned policies that have been embraced by public health experts. He's called it a good thing for younger, healthy people to be exposed to the virus, falsely claimed that children are near zero risk, and talked about how herd immunity should be the nation's objective. And so the question is, will first of all, the policy has not changed in any material way. Secondly, will the distractions work? And third, are there bedrock issues that will just hold Trump's supporters, particularly in the southern states, tightly to him, despite this onrush of the pandemic reality. And the New York Times this morning had an interesting article about people who are bedrock Trump supporters, and evangelicals are particularly close to Trump, and many believe that he succeeded on issues like hardening the southern border, appointing conservative judges, taking on China, putting America first. They're also upset about cultural issues that he's raised in the past, such as kneeling during the national anthem. They're upset that more people are not condemning the violence that's grown out of the police brutality demonstrations. I mean, if he can distract, and if he can do things that appeal to his core supporters, he'll retain some support. But the truth of the matter is that the pandemic has really penetrated the bubble that he's enjoyed for a long time, and it's going to be. That's why the polling that you cited at the beginning of the conversation has shown, that his support is being undermined.
Right. At this stage, I'd love people to start getting their questions in, because I think we've got about 40 minutes here, and I know you'd have lots of good questions, and I want to get those in. So please start putting them in the Q&A bubble, which is just below you here. Simon, just as a small aside, I don't think many people know about QAnon and why that has stirred up a bit of debate. And just say what's been happening in Texas about the catchphrase that the Republican Party is using there.
Right. It's they're denying that it comes from that it stems from QAnon, which, just like as a brief description, is this very complex web of conspiracy theories, which has these ideas have really gained traction in American politics in recent months, almost parallel to the explosion of the pandemic. And what we've seen is various candidates, Republican candidates around the country, who are believers in QAnon conspiracies, winning primaries, and being in a pretty good position to actually win election to the House of Representatives come November.
So just to correct me if I'm wrong, but the QAnon conspiracy theory is roughly as follows. There's a conspiracy of Democratic pedophile Satanists who have created the virus, a myth about the virus, in order to undermine President Trump. Is that more or less it?
You hit the nail on the head right there, Nick. Yeah, that's a very good synopsis of what these theories are. It's very hard to describe them concisely, actually. But just like one indication of the traction that they're getting. And I know this sounds outlandish, it just sounds crazy. Oh, these crazy Yanks, they believe in anything. This is our politics in the year of 2020. In Palm Beach, in Florida, for instance, you have a candidate, and this is where President Trump lives now. That's his official residence. He has a resort there and a colossal mansion, of course, where he entertains guests and political allies. And Laura Loomer, who was this fringe figure in Republican politics, emerged victorious in a primary, and looks like she could easily now win a seat in Congress. And this is someone who just who voices theories which are just really, really on the margins of political debate in the country, but it's actually getting a lot of traction. So one interesting thing is that Republicans are tending to accept these candidates and bringing them into the fold in kind of like a big tent type of strategy of their own. And you don't see much criticism from the Democratic side, which is very interesting. You do see, Republicans at their convention this week in North Carolina, for instance, tarring Democrats as a whole as socialists and calling them leftist extremists and saying that they're going to, turn the United States into the next Venezuela. You don't see Democrats attacking the extremists on the Republican side who are actually winning races and doing quite well and thriving. So it's just, you know, another real kind of like volatile political ingredient this year that we're seeing. And in Texas, of course, Texas is home to sort of every type of Republican belief imaginable. It's a mosaic of Republican ideas from the fringes to more moderate and pragmatic Republicans. And it's really, represents kind of like a struggle for control of the party, I think. And Texas arguably is the Republicans' largest prize. And it's their most important bastion, which is what makes it an incredible battleground this year, and just an incredibly fascinating place to see all of these issues playing out. Yeah. What types of Republicans will see their influence increasing this year? Who are going to win these races? Who's already winning the primaries? Who's coming out on top? And will that allow Republicans to maintain control of Texas, which of course is the second most populous state in the country after California?
Yeah, I think what happens to the Republican Party after this, whether Trump wins or doesn't win, is one big question. I do want to pick up on a point that I think we've all of us have been making, which is that this polarization, this enormous division within electoral politics, has enabled a severing of the link between what's going on in the economy and presidential approval ratings. Normally, if you had a bad economy, the president's approval ratings would go right down. And that just doesn't seem to be happening. But Trump has gone into this, going into this election with relatively high approval ratings when it comes to the economy, which to me is, incredible. And I think, Simon, is that fair? Do you think that's fair to say it's because of this deep division, deep political division, the polarization that exists within the US?
I think it's pretty stunning. Yeah, the economic figures are horrific. And you just see the destruction on the streets of nearly every city in this country, every city and small town in this country. It's brutal. And yet there have been measures taken to mitigate the economic fallout, such as, what the Fed has been doing has been incredibly productive, and it's yielding real results. And also measures taken to bolster the stock market, which is where a lot of Americans who vote have their retirement savings locked up in there. So they pay a lot of attention to those indices, and the stock market is performing relatively well. There's been a delinking of the market from the economic realities on the ground, which is really interesting this year. And will that be enough?
The market is an all-time high, isn't it? Or near its all-time high, isn't it?
It's just stunning. It's stunning. Yeah, it's really quite something. You have, large corporations and very wealthy individuals who are doing extremely well during this crisis. When you have big parts of the real economy, the functioning economy, that are hurting tremendously, and a lot of pain on the ground. So yeah, it's a real.
I may have got that statement on the stock market wrong, but it's certainly it's stunningly high for how the economy is doing. Let's bring in those questions. We've got George Feiger coming up first, followed by Simon Jackson. George, do you want to go ahead first? You just have to open your microphone, the button on the bottom left-hand side. There we go. Go ahead, George.
My question is simply whether, given the polarization and the separation of people from factual evidence, what happens if Trump loses? What if can he then reject his loss and claim that it was all fraud? Will lots of people then rise up and support him? Are we on the edge of some sort of significant civil unrest in this case?
Jeff, do you want to take that first?
Sure. And I unfortunately am not going to be able to give you a satisfactory answer. We're really, there's a storm of events swirling now that we haven't faced before. We have a president who is trying to suppress the vote. We have a president who has tried to, in advance of his potential defeat, suggest that the voting won't even if it occurs, won't be fair. We have references, at the highest levels of government, meaning, by Trump and a few people associated with him, to the possibility of, to the fact that his supporters have more guns than other people do. It's just, and we have the pandemic, which creates, genuine challenges for the voting process in the United States, which is always, unlike other countries, one of the unique features of the American democratic system is that it's very localized, and the control over it is localized. And so it's disorganized and chaotic and not very well funded and not very systematically efficient. And so you throw the pandemic and the fact that many more people are going to be using mail-in ballots this year, and which creates uncertainty about how rapidly will they be counted and how accurately will they be counted, and so there, people are already projecting and predicting that it's unlikely we'd know, by midnight on the day of the election, as we have forever, who the winner is, and it could be days. And in that time, what will people say? What will they do? What accusations?
One does remember hanging Chads in Florida in 2000, so that's possibly the other exception. So Simon, I think there's no doubt there's going to be a huge number of disputes about those ballots and how they're being processed. But Trump has to leave office by January the 3rd, isn't it? I mean, he has to, legally, he just can't stay in. He can't delay it beyond that, can he, Simon?
The short answer is no one knows. I think we're headed into uncharted territory on the day of the election, the days after the election, the weeks after the election, and potentially for the months following the election. It's a rare occurrence indeed to have a president of the republic out there casting doubt over the legitimacy of our elections. I mean, this is a sacred and sacrosanct feature of our democracy in the United States. The idea that if you lose an election, you accept the results, you vacate that office, and you allow your successor to get into the White House. To have a current occupant who is vociferously and actively making, a central feature of his campaign, casting doubt on the legitimacy of that process, is a new thing in American politics. And something that Jeff mentioned and that I see on the ground here in this part of the country is the very vocal support for Trump's ideas from some of his most fervent supporters. They come in the form of these armed militia groups. Again, New Mexico is an open carry state, so anyone can walk around here with a huge firearm, with a gun in their holster. They can walk into stores like that. They can walk into all sorts of establishments and offices, no problem, no questions asked. And this is a country that is awash in guns. So I think that is a very real concern. Anyone who's attempting to downplay that right now, I think is just really ignoring the realities on the ground.
Yeah, very, very frightening stuff. I mean, we recall the images in Lansing, Michigan, with those militias coming out armed, protesting against the governor's actions there in her bid to control the virus. Open carry is permitted in many US states, but the prospect of it being used in protests, as we've seen in the last few months, is not a good one. George, I don't think we've got a clear answer for you there, but it's certainly a worrying answer nevertheless. Let's move on to Neil Fleming. You've got a good question, Neil. Just uncheck your microphone so you can talk. If you look at the bottom left hand of your screen, you should be able to see the mute button, and you just unmute it. There you go. Go ahead.
Got it. From the very early morning in Australia, we could give you some lessons on waiting on results on election day for days and even weeks, since we've had so many elections and changes of leader in the last 10 years. But my question is about the reality of the Electoral College, even as compared with what happened in 2016. I was one of those who was on the tour in 2016 with Nicholas, and I'm still getting over the shock. But looking at the states that Trump won, in 2016, I look at the list and I look at particularly the competitive states, as they're so called, in 2020. And it is interesting that the 10 or 12 of them, most of them have a sizable number of electoral college votes each. You've talked about Texas, but there are several others as well. And just looking at the polls, and of course in America, it's entirely dependent upon how many Americans actually will turn out to vote, as you've said, and the ease with which they can turn out to vote. But the polls seem so favourably charged towards Biden in so many of those states that even if you concede states like Texas, Iowa, Georgia, Ohio, North Carolina, Arizona, even if Trump were to win all of those, as opposed to accepting that Biden's going to win a fistful of states as well.
Neil, I think we've got the sense of your question, so I'm just going to go straight to Simon, because
fair enough, yeah.
I guess that Jeff might echo what you were saying, but Simon, can you play devil's advocate, please? I mean, there's a possibility that he could still win some of these states, and the polls got it wrong last time.
Yes.
Oh, I think there is a very real possibility that Trump could win the states that he carried in 2016, and even win possibly some other states. We had an excellent piece in the New York Times that we published over the weekend that compared this election, for instance, to the election that we saw in 1988, when George Bush father ran against Michael Dukakis. At this point in that campaign in the summer of 1988, Michael Dukakis had a 17-point national lead in the polls, which is a lot higher than where Biden is at right now. A lot of people thought that election was in the bag for the Democrats. Many factors seemed to be leaning in their direction. And then the Bush campaign managed very effectively to turn things around with essentially what were, fear tactics, concerns over Dukakis's record on crime. They used tactics which were later considered explicitly racist and just fear mongering over, Dukakis letting out inmates in Massachusetts who then went on to commit crimes. So I think we're just very, very early in the game right now. And I think a lot of us are also feel a bit burned after 2016, when the polls were so favorable toward Hillary Clinton heading into the election, heading into the eve of the election, that it was just stunning to see how they could get things wrong, especially in those key battleground states. The national polls held up fairly well. And of course, Hillary Clinton ended up winning the overall race by 3 million votes. I mean, she clobbered Trump in the popular vote. But what counts in this country, and we have a very archaic system, like it or not, and it's very, very difficult to change the Constitution to do away with the Electoral College. It's what we have. And I think that the Republicans do see a very clear path to victory for Trump still. I think it's very early on right now.
And just to remind us, where would that path be? Through which states?
Oh, I think that it would be through Texas and Florida first and foremost, and then through Midwestern battleground states like Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, and to a lesser extent, perhaps Minnesota.
But the point is there that he won many of those states on a very narrow margin. So I'm just looking at, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, only by 1%. So
right.
Based on what's happening to suburban voters and to sort of independents, appealing to your base isn't going to be good enough to win those.
Not at all. No, you have to peel away the votes of moderates and perhaps even some conservative Democrats. So it may be an uphill battle from a fact-based perspective, from someone who's looking at just like the horrific death count that increases every single day in this country, the case counts that are increasing, the toll on the economy that this pandemic is taking. that's not the prism through which many of these voters or potential voters are viewing things.
Jeff, that's the point, isn't it? The facts don't matter. I was watching Donald Trump Jr. On the Republican convention earlier, and you could have exchanged the word President Trump for God, and it would have made sense. It was like an evangelical rally again. He was asking people to believe in him. All you had to do was believe in him and you'd get rich, you'd have a wonderful family, everything was going to be great. The facts do not matter.
I think that's correct. It's a fact-free environment in many cases. And just to add something to what Simon said, I think that the Democrats have not quite yet found their voice, even on the pandemic issue. If the Trump has been saying, and it still holds some appeal in red states in particular, that the pandemic social distancing has damaged the economy in ways that are harmful to people across income levels, and that we have to kind of get on with life and get on with normal economic activity, and that his policies are the pathway to revive the economy. Basically, the spread of COVID be damned. Biden, what I find mystifying is that Biden could have presented himself as the candidate that was most interested in reviving the economy and making that his principal argument for election, and said, look, I want more badly than Trump to put the economy in working order. I just have a different path to get there. The Trump path hasn't worked. My path is to make things, to slow things down in the short term, but then to be able, so that we can rev them up in the long term.
Jeff,
there was some of that.
I want to bring in Stuart Williams here, because Stuart Williams has got a question that comes straight to this point. So Stuart, if you could unplug your microphone, because this echoes what you're saying, Jeff. So Stuart, go ahead, Stuart.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I picked up this point that Biden said that the scientists tell him to, he's going to shut down the whole economy. And I think, what is this guy talking about? If you're trying to appeal to people who want to revive the economy, want to keep their, as you say, real jobs, not ones they can do at home, saying you're going to shut down the whole economy, if the scientists tell you, I mean, you get scientists to tell you anything, depending on which one you choose. It just struck me as a crazy thing to say.
Yeah. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in another question off the back of you there, Stuart, as well. Piers Reynolds, I can see in front of me. So Piers, go ahead.
Well, the question I asked earlier was, were the anti-Trump Republicans, such as John Kasich, who spoke at the convention, and also the Lincoln Project, are they having any impact at all?
Simon, do you want to see that?
I think that they absolutely are having an impact, at least in the way in the war of ideas that's taking place right now. Whether that's going to translate into results in November, I think it's still unclear. But you have, for instance, the Lincoln Project, which is a group of disaffected Republicans, the Never Trumpers, and their social media campaigns have been just phenomenal. In fact, they've kind of like blown away what the Democrats themselves have been doing in terms of attacking Trump and questioning his business ethics, his outright lying repeatedly and creatively. I mean, they're just, the ads that they've been making are very pointed and very strategic and just very well done. And they're made for the age of social media. They're made to be shared quickly, commented on, picked apart. It's just very interesting. One of the things that did emerge, though, last week's convention, the Democratic convention, which was interesting, that you had various of these, former Republicans or moderate Republicans allowed to speak at the convention, and that actually angered, a fair number of people in the Democratic base who questioned, like, wait a second, whose party is this? And do we really think that we're going to be able to persuade enough Republican voters to cast ballots for Biden instead of energizing our own base? And an enormous pool of voters. There was a lot of criticism, for instance, the lack of Latino speakers at the convention. And Latinos now comprise the largest minority group, for lack of a better term, in the country. They're one of the largest blocks of voters in states such as California, Arizona, Texas, Florida, and New York. And yet they were conspicuously absent from the speaker schedules of the convention in a way that really put off a lot of people. So there's some interesting tension taking place, and I just think it's like too early to say whether they're really going to be able to make a big dent in the people who voted for Trump back in 2016 and lure them over to the other side.
Okay, we're going to add another note of skepticism. Jim Lernstein, who's speaking from Washington, D.C., has got another point. Go ahead, Jim.
Am I on?
Yeah, you're on, yeah.
A couple of comments. First of all, it was not only Dukakis way ahead of Bush, it was Carter way ahead of Reagan 7 weeks before the election. So you never know what's going to happen in the last 6 weeks in American elections. And then there is, am I still on?
Yeah, you're still on. You're still on. Go on. Ignore the phone.
And then there is always the October surprise. I mean, the October surprise in the last election was Jim Comey's letter. In general, I think Republicans are better at October surprises than Democrats. And third, when you're looking at worrying signs, I picked up the New York Times book review section on Sunday and found to my horror that Sean Hannity's new book is #1 on the bestseller list. And Michelle Obama's book had dropped off after more than 80 weeks on the bestseller list. Those are my 3 comments.
Okay, Jim, thank you very much indeed. I'm not going to put those to the panelists because I think they stand alone. I would love to bring in a comment from Marty Ryan. If Marty Ryan is still there, I don't know if Marty is. Not too sure, but no, I think she's not. So I'm going to read it for her. Isn't the biggest issue the fear of white people about losing their dominance as the population demographics change? We've obviously seen a big shift in the South, which has got an increase of Latino voters, younger voters, and so you perhaps could see white voters be perceived as feeling under threat. And very interesting, during the Republican convention, having the couple who came out to defend their property with weapons when there was a Black Lives Matter protest going in front of their house. And that couple were brought to speak before the Republican convention. So, Jeff, is that an undercurrent in this election as those protests have been playing out? The sort of fear of, well, Trump certainly being playing on it, and it seems to be gaining some traction. Jeff.
Yes, I mean, there's just clearly polls show and lots of rhetoric makes clear that Trump's support lies in part among people who are struggling with the idea of diversity. And Trump clearly struggles with that. They find resonance in his very public struggles with it. That explains some of his support. Other aspects of people who support other reasons why people support him, though, are not related to that, but related to these other cultural issues. The issue of crime, the issue of which has a racial undercurrent to it, but the issue of appointing conservative judges, protecting the wealthy, in tax policy and in legislation. It's not just that. There are various reasons why people remain tightly bound to Trump.
Right. Okay. I just want to bring up Diane Cook. I don't know if she's there, but her question for those who joined us earlier this year during the primaries, we were able to see Biden talk in Des Moines. And I've got to say, all of us were pretty shocked. We did not think that this guy was capable of lasting the campaign, let alone actually winning the nomination. Diane, I think you've got a question that addresses this. Diane, go ahead.
Well, coming from a country where sometimes one feels the population has lost its moorings, and this conversation is very much in the same vein, I can't be superior, but really with my thought was with Biden's age, sitting from outside in the UK, it looks we have this fight of the septuagenarians. I'm just wondering if for the future, or maybe because of Biden's age, the vice president becomes much more important. To what extent is that, do you think, that people would be looking at Kamala Harris almost like as an alternative candidate, notwithstanding that Biden is the candidate?
Yes, Simon, I mean, go ahead. I mean, would the candidate, would the Democratic Party look very different with a bolder, stronger candidate, a younger candidate in place? And how much is Kamala Harris taking up the slack from Biden?
You know, that's just a wonderful question, and it's one that I can say that we're obsessing over in the newsroom of the New York Times right now. I can say this about Biden as a candidate. I think that he's actually an exceptionally strong candidate for this election this year. He's of all of the potential opponents that Trump had going into this election, he is one of the toughest to attack, in that he really is a centrist. He built his whole career in the Senate as someone who could reach across the aisle, hammer out compromises, and just, you know, Joe Biden is someone who does not come across as threatening to moderate voters, to independent voters, to moderate Republicans who just might be considering another option. He's someone that they feel comfortable with, which is really interesting. And another aspect to this was his very remarkable speech, his speech accepting the nomination at the convention last week, which was perhaps due to low expectations going into the event. I think he exceeded those expectations and just did surprisingly well. He was coherent, he was forceful. He made a very strong case for his vision of things, which was really interesting. With all of that said, he's old, but Biden is, he looks different from the other candidates on the Democratic side. He speaks differently from them, and he thinks differently from them as well. That's why someone like Kamala Harris is so important as a running mate, in that she just represents a different generation. She appeals to different parts of the base, especially to African American women who are the base of the Democratic Party. They turn out in higher numbers than just about any other block of voters for the party's candidates. They can be relied upon to do campaigning, to do organizing. And so the choice of someone like Kamala Harris is just crucial. Another aspect to what she brings to the table is that she is the daughter of immigrants. Her father came from Jamaica, her mother came from India, and that messaging, I think, is something that can really resonate in a year like this, especially when there are doubts around whether Biden can, doubts around his health, doubts about his mental acuity, doubts about whether he's really prepared for the job. And trust me, the Trump campaign is eviscerating Biden on this. Trump calls Biden Sleepy Joe in his tweets. He's already branded him as someone who's relatively anemic and slow moving. So it's really crucial that they pick someone like Kamala to make up the rest of the ticket. Okay,
we've just got 5 minutes left, so I'm gonna have to pack in the questions. I'm going to pick up Alan Pardo's question, which he said, we didn't get an answer to the earlier query about Biden's statement that he would, if scientists told him to do so, close the US economy down. No British politician would say that. what might be the effect of Biden's statement on the American electorate. I guess a key point here is that he couldn't close the economy down because it's in the power of governors and not the president. So can you both just to follow that up, which we were discussing earlier, Jeff, his comments about the economy, saying he would shut it down if he had to. Jeff.
Yeah, so that's a rhetorical overstatement, as you said. No one's talking about shutting down the economy. You cannot shut down the economy and still have the supply of food and other basic essentials. So that's not really what people are discussing. What's clear is that a variety of countries have succeeded in getting the pandemic under control by largely restricting social activity, combining it with contact tracing and quick test results and quick medical support. We still haven't seen that in America, despite 6 months of the pandemic.
Yeah, Simon, did Biden's comments land him in trouble? Those comments about the economy, did you pick up on that?
Oh, I don't know. I agree that it may have some kind of like rhetorical flourish or overreach to it, a comment like that. And Biden makes a lot of comments, and he's known for not being incredibly precise. But one way to look at this is that if it's actually that there is an economic argument for making a very aggressive turn on handling the pandemic, getting the numbers under control quickly through really intense distancing measures and other mitigation policies, allowing the economy to restart relatively quickly, and just giving large companies, states, investors more clarity on how they can plan out their investments for the months ahead. So it may be an issue of how to frame this, and Biden has clearly said that he's going to be relying on epidemiologists, scientific research, facts for his pandemic response. But I do think he has to be really careful about how he frames things in terms of.
Okay, we haven't had a chance to address all the questions here. There are several about the postal system. We've addressed it in part. We do think there's going to be a lot of chaos. That there's a lot of room for disputing the election result when it comes out. So 3 people had questions on that. Somebody here says, are we seeing the end of democracy? Is the army ready, like Hong Kong? Rest assured, we'll give our ex-colonists asylum if it comes to it.
We might need it.
Yeah. So that's the flavor. There's one question here I do want to get answered before we go. We are, I think, if Trump does badly, about to see a huge change across the board of seats in both the Senate, Congress, but also within the states themselves. Simon, can you just talk about that where you are and what the impact of that might be in the long term?
Well, if this happens, and I'm still a bit skeptical as to whether it could happen, I think that one place which really showcases this trend is Arizona, which has traditionally, and until very recently, been one of the reddest, one of the most Republican states in the country, known for a huge anti-immigration effort in the previous decade, very conservative right-wing politicians at the helm of nearly every statewide office until recently, thanks to in part to demographic changes, also to people moving into Arizona from other states, especially from California, where they're priced out of real estate quite often. You have things that are really changing in a state like that. And so there you could have a Democrat picking up a Senate seat, which would be huge for the Democrats' ambitions of retaking the Senate. And if Biden actually wins, that's crucial for them in terms of getting anything done. Our legislative process is so complicated at this point that they really need to control that chamber with a good margin in order to get things done. So this could really happen, and those races, if there is big turnout in a place like Arizona, that would impact all of the down ballot races as well. So that means for the state legislature, Democrats have been dreaming about flipping those chambers now for decades. They've been inching closer with each race, and so we could see some action on that if there's some real energy around a Biden candidacy, around voting for Biden this time around.
Yeah.
So it's just going to be fascinating to see how it all happens.
And I know that situation has been echoed in places like Iowa, for example, which is traditionally much more conservative, with many seats going to the Democrats in the midterms, and then more recently as well, the polls going their way. I want to thank you both very much indeed for joining us. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I'm sorry we couldn't answer everyone's questions. I know Simon's got to go. I'm hoping perhaps that Jeff can stay on for a few more minutes now, because I know there are many more people here who've got more questions. So Jeff is in the middle of moving house in a pandemic, so his time is precious too. But maybe he can give us a few more minutes, I don't know. My thanks once again to Simon Romero and Jeff Smith for their time. Our next Insight is this Thursday at 3 p.m. BST. It looks at human rights on the front line, and it's with Peter Buchart and Stacey Sullivan. Peter Buchart was the former Emergencies Director for Human Rights Watch, and Stacey Sullivan is their Director of Communications and Advocacy. And that'll be a fascinating discussion. It's about really how do you work on human rights in a conflict environment. And so it should be a very, very interesting discussion. My thanks again to Simon Romero and for their time. Thank you very much and goodbye.